How exactly are light boards used for transferring drawings? And can I trace right on watercolor paper even though watercolor paper is thicker? And will a light board work for you and the kind of art that you like working on? In this video, I'm going to be sharing must-know information on light boards, and I'm going to be taking you step by step through my process, what I do to trace over reference photos or sketches that I've created myself, and how I do my transferring onto watercolor paper before starting with a painting process. Last week, I shared a video where I explain how I use tracing paper for this same purpose. So if you haven't checked that out and you're interested in learning how to use tracing paper to do your transferring, maybe you don't have a light board, I would recommend checking that one out. I'll leave a link to that in the recommended resources below. All right, let's jump in. All right, let's talk about the supplies that I would recommend having on hand for your transferring using a light board. Here is my light board. It's pretty small. I got this via Amazon. It is 12 inches in width times 9 inches in height, which means that a letter-sized format would fit on here perfectly. There are definitely larger light boards out there, so if you work in larger formats, I would recommend looking for something larger. This light board is pretty sturdy, but very thin and pretty lightweight. It's not very heavy at all. When it comes to the power cord, I can connect this light board directly to my computer via a USB cable, or I can plug the USB end into this adapter box thing and plug it into a wall. Right now, I'm going to just connect it directly into my computer and use my computer as my power supply. Okay, so my light board has a few different settings. It has low light and then like a medium light and a more intense light. And the way that mine works is you do one quick touch of that button on the upper left to turn it on or off. And if you want to make the light less intense or more intense, you have to leave your finger on that button until the light is as intense as you want it to be. And I almost always turn that light up to the brightest, most intense setting, especially because I do my transferring or tracing right on or directly on my watercolor sheet, which are relatively thick, right? They're much thicker than regular paper and many types of drawing papers. Before getting into anything else, I will say that it is very important that when you're using a light board, the lighting in the room that you're working in is relatively dim or as dim as possible. If you're working in a very brightly lit room, maybe you're working directly in front of a window or under very bright lights, that is going to make things more difficult to see as you're tracing. When I filmed this video, it was approximately 1:30 p.m., so it was pretty bright out. I made sure to close the curtains in this room and turn off the lights above me so that I could see things better. All right, aside from your light board, you're going to need either your reference photo to trace over or some kind of outline drawing that you're going to trace over. I have both of these on hand because I want to show you the difference between working with a reference photo on a light board versus working with an outline drawing. And I also want to provide a little tip so that you can see the outline drawing better in case you're working with one. So this is the watercolor sheet that I'm going to be doing my tracing on. And this is exactly the type of watercolor paper that I like working on. This is 140 pounds or 300 GSM in thickness or in weight, which makes it mid-weight when it comes to watercolor paper. It's not the thinnest and it's not the thickest either. This is cold pressed paper, which means it has some texture to it, and it is 100% cotton. Aside from this, I have my HB drawing pencil, which is what I like using when I am drawing right on my watercolor paper in order to keep my outline sketch nice and light so that I'm not able to see that pencil work through my paint at the end. And I have a couple different erasers, a regular soft graphite eraser and a kneadable eraser. And finally, an extra tool that I would recommend having on hand, especially if you have trouble seeing your outline drawing through your watercolor paper, or you're finding that your eyes are hurting. This definitely happens to me. My eyes are pretty sensitive to the light, I find. is either a thicker drawing pen, maybe a 0.7, 0.8 tip size, or alternatively to that, you could also use a black Sharpie. I'll show you how I use that in just a bit. Okay, so having said all that, let's jump right in. I want to show you what the difference is between working with a reference photo under your watercolor sheet and using an outline drawing under your watercolor sheet. Whatever it is that you're working with, whether it's a photo or an outline drawing, you place it face up on your light board, and then you place your watercolor sheet or whatever drawing paper it is that you want to do your transferring onto right over that image or that photo. As you can see, that image is visible, but I can totally understand how this is not visible enough for a lot of people. Even I find it difficult to see some of the edges of the shapes in this image. And of course, it's really going to depend on the thickness of the paper that you're going to do your transferring onto and the image itself. Some images are going to be easier to see than others. If you're working with images where there are lots of light colors, maybe whites and beiges and things like that, or you're working with an image that is even slightly overexposed, the edges of the different elements included in the image can be very difficult to see. Versus if you're working with an image where there is a lot of contrast, meaning you have very dark areas and very light areas and a balance of darks and lights, that is likely going to be more easy to see through that paper that you've placed on top. You're going to see the edges of your elements much more clearly, and thus your transferring is going to be more easy to do. And now this is what it looks like to work with an outline drawing. Maybe you created your drawing on a separate sketchbook and you're going to be tracing over that, or someone else has prepared an outline sketch and you have printed that and you're going to be tracing over that. This is easier to see and understand because all we see are lines here. We don't see all of these different value shapes that we have to make sense of. And all of the edges of our shapes have already been kind of pointed out for us. This said, the thicker and bolder those lines are, the more easily we're going to see them. And what I do a lot of the time is I create my preliminary sketches freehand on a separate sheet of paper or sketchbook, and I trace over my sketches. And I do that because I like practicing my drawing as often as I can, and I do make lots of changes to the composition usually before starting with my painting process. And if I were to place a drawing made with just graphite pencils under my watercolor sheet, I'm likely not going to see that drawing at all. That would mean that I would have to trace over my graphite drawing with a drawing pen or a Sharpie if I wanted to be able to see that through that watercolor paper. This isn't an issue when I'm using tracing paper for my transferring. And this is why I wanted to make sure to share both transferring methods with you, both using tracing paper and using a light board, because it is going to be a case-by-case scenario where, depending on what you like to do and depending on the subject and the image itself, it might be best to use one method over the other. And in my previous video, I also shared that I don't always transfer. Many times when I'm comfortable with the subject matter and I don't think that I'm going to be doing too much erasing on my watercolor sheet, I just go ahead and sketch on my watercolor sheet freehand. I'll make sure to link to that previous video where I talk about how I use tracing paper for my transferring in the recommended resources below. So here is my little Sharpie tip in case you'd like to make your outline drawing more visible. What this entails is tracing over that line work with a black Sharpie so that your lines become bolder and thicker and you're able to see them better under your watercolor sheet. I'm going to trace over this section here and leave the other untraced so that you can see what this looks like under my watercolor sheet when I place it on my light board. Notice how you can see the napkins and these cookies on the right a lot more clearly than everything else. Alright, so now that I have explained the difference between working with a reference photo versus working with an outline sketch, and I've also provided that little tip on how to make that outline drawing more visible, let me walk you through the rest of my process. I'm just going to keep working with my outline drawing here. I place my watercolor paper over my image, making sure that it is exactly centered where I want it to be. And then I go ahead and start doing my tracing using my HB pencil. I make sure to draw lightly. I am not pressing down hard at all. And this is because of a few different reasons. The first one being that I don't want to see my outline drawing through my watercolor paint at the end. The second being that I don't want to scratch or damage my watercolor paper because I know that I'm not going to be able to fix that if I do. And finally, I also want to be able to erase my mistakes and refine my drawing if I have to. You can see how I am using my non-dominant hand. For me, this is my left hand, to hold my watercolor sheet over my image and my light board so that that watercolor sheet can stay in place and things don't move around as I am doing my tracing. Okay, and once I'm done, I put my light board and my outline sketch away. I grab my backing board that I'm going to be working on, and I just use regular 1-inch masking tape to tape my watercolor paper down onto my backing board. If you're afraid that your masking tape might damage your watercolor paper at the end when you remove it, I would recommend running those pieces of tape over your clothes a couple of times, and that'll weaken that adhesive and make it much less likely that you'll damage your paper at the end. All right, so once I'm ready, the last thing that I do is I go back to my HB pencil. I do any minor refinements. Sometimes I even map out little shapes to help me understand where highlights are going to be so that I can keep them protected throughout the painting process. Or sometimes I also map out darkest sections where I want to make sure to go in and push those darkest darks. Sometimes, especially when I see that certain sections of my outline drawing are a little bit dark, I go in with my kneadable eraser and simply do a little bit of gentle tapping over those areas to remove excess graphite. I just want to make sure that my outline sketch is clean and light, and make sure that I don't have extra graphite floating around on my watercolor paper, which can muddy up my vibrant watercolors. And with that, I'm ready to start with my watercolor painting.